So here we are speaking about Jewish geography, and of course, speaking about the story of where the Jewish nation has ended up in the craziest of places. We'll start off with a classic joke, classic story. That baby camel goes to Mama Camel, right, and says, "Mama, why is it that us camels we have these long eyelashes always get in the way?" And Mama says, "Because we're built to go in the desert, and there could be sandstorms over there, or haboobs if we're in Arizona desert, and so we need to be able to keep all the dust out of our eyes, so we have these long eyelashes." All right. Then baby camel thinks and goes back to Mama Camel, and this is of course a very curious camel, very inquisitive, and baby camel says, "Well, Mama, why do we have this big hump on our back?" Well, Mama says, and of course the Mama wasn't updated with the latest science, and so in her understanding, she says, "Well, my dear child, it's because when we walk through the long deserts. Walk through the desert, we could go for many days without drinking water. So we store all our water in these humps." Interesting. Until the baby camel goes back to thinking and comes back to his mama and says, "Mama, why do we have these big wide feet? They look off. They're different than everyone else's hooves. Why do we have these wide feet?" And Mama says, "Well, we walk on the sand, and the sand can be in the desert sand. It's not very stable, so we need to have a flat foot in order to keep our balance." And then the baby says, "Well, Mama, that's a great answer. But if that's the case, what are we doing in the Bronx Zoo?"
No. Okay.
Okay. So the question is, what are we doing wherever we are? Okay. So starting off, we'll start off with, the theory over here, the idea that we're basing this off of is that where Jews are now is not our natural homeland. So what is our homeland? So to see what our homeland is, of course, we go back to Genesis, Bereshis, and God tells Abraham in the covenant, makes a covenant with Abraham with all of his descendants, and he tells him, and God appeared to Abraham and said, "To your descendants I will give this land," the land that Abraham was then in, the land of Israel. And then it goes on and says, "In that day God made a covenant with Avram." Side note, his name originally was Avram, and then after his circumcision, his name was changed to Avraham, with the added H or Hey inside. So God made a covenant with Avram, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt until the great river, the Euphrates." Okay, so the land of Israel is the Jewish homeland. It will take some time until the Jewish people made it there, but we always knew that was their homeland, and it's said even in the past tense, I have given, even though it only happened in the future, because when God says something, you can be certain it will happen. Ultimately, together with that, God also told Abraham that we're going to go through a journey until we make it there. We're going to be in Egypt for 400 years, which is ultimately just 210 years of a journey through the desert. And that's actually the connection to this week's Torah portion. This week we have a double reading in the Torah. And the second reading speaks about Matos-Mas'ei b'nei Yisrael. These were the travels of the Jewish nation in the desert, 42 stops that they made, or 42 travels that they made. And the Jewish people were traveling then, but we have continued being a wandering nation. And then they made it to the land of Israel. But all of that was told by God told Abraham, this is going to happen. And he also told him what's going to happen later on. Your children, your descendants will be exiled from their homeland. Right? And that's what we say we say that why were we exiled? Well, first of all, it's prophesied to Abraham, but also because of our sins, we were exiled from our land and we're distanced from our soil. And essentially what this is saying is that when we have the recognition that essentially our homeland is the land of Israel, it was taken from us. And it's not in a fully established as a Jewish homeland, because we weren't acting in accordance with how a Jew should act, and ultimately will be returned to there in the Messiah when Mashiach comes. We already see some of that happening now in the prelude to Mashiach, that so many Jews are coming to the land of Israel, but it's still, you can't say that's fully living up to its potential being a Jewish homeland. I would say that many who live in the land of Israel aren't living in it in a Jewish way, but that's for another discussion. It's definitely beautiful that it's a homeland now for Jewish people, and we pray for the day that it will be a homeland for all Jewish people. But until then, we are where we are. We're all over. And so we'll go through a bit of the history, and this is really what we're getting at, what we'll be discussing, is all the travels and the stops that the Jewish nation has made throughout our history. Okay, and there's going to be a side point to something, which is a fascinating topic, but we mostly will stay out of it. We'll just to dabble in it, which is that the Jewish people, they were in the land of Israel after Moses brought them to the doorstep of the land. Joshua brought them into the land of Israel. They conquered the 7 nations. One made peace, and the other 6 they had to conquer. After 14 years, they were settling in, and then they had their judges who would lead them as spiritual and also political leaders. After the judges came the era of kings. The first of the great kings being King Saul, and then after King Saul's son, King David became the king of the Jewish nation. The Davidic dynasty started that, and that's from King David. There always will be kings. However, after King David's son Solomon, in whose era the temple in Jerusalem was built, there was a split in the Jewish nation. So yes, there was always the Davidic dynasty, but then there was a kingdom of the 10 tribes, which was otherwise known as there was a split between the kingdom of Judah, which was the kings of David is from the tribe of Judah, and then on the other hand, there was the kingdom of Israel. There were times they got together, they were on better terms. Oftentimes they weren't on great terms, but after a few hundred years, the great conqueror Sancherib from Assyria came, and he conquered many lands. And one part of his tactic was he conquered a land, he would ship off the people over there and send them somewhere else. That way they should lose their foothold and they shouldn't be able to easily make an uprising. And he conquered the land of the 10 tribes and shipped them off. So over here we have the verse in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, which was the capital city of the kingdom of Israel as opposed to the kingdom of Judah. He deported the Israelites, meaning the 10 tribes, other than the tribe of Judah, Benjamin, also many of the Levites, and some other Jews who were going along with them. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Chalach, at the river Chabor, at the river Gozan, and in the cities of Media. We don't know exactly which cities these are, but this is where the 10 tribes were originally sent. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the lost 10 tribes, right? People are searching for the lost tribes. There's a matter of difference of opinion. There's an opinion in the Talmud that says that Jeremiah, who was just a few decades after they were exiled, actually brought them back. He went out and returned them to the Jewish nation. They rejoined them, and the 10 tribes are lost no more. There are other opinions that say that they're lost and they'll be ultimately returned with the coming of Mashiach. And there have been different sightings throughout the ages, supposedly, of the 10 tribes. But that's a whole discussion in its own right, one which I will stay far away from over here. It's a very fascinating discussion in its own right, and we'll go straight to what we know of as the bulk of what will continue to be the Jewish community, which was the kingdom of Judah as it continued in the land of Israel. And what happened was just a few decades after the 10 tribes were exiled, maybe it was about 100 years later, I don't recall exactly. Over a century later, the king Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, exiled the Jewish nation from its homeland from Israel. So the Jewish people were in Israel for roughly 800 or so years, maybe a bit over 800 years. And then they were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylonia. You have in Psalms what the Levites sang as they were leaving Israel, being marched on a march of shame to Babylonia. There they say, by the rivers of Babylonia, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. And their captors had asked them to sing songs. So they said they didn't sing the songs. Instead, there on the willows, we hung up our lyres. For our captors asked for us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of God on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Remember, O Eternal One, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cry, strip her to her very foundations. Fear Babylonia, you predator, a blessing on the one who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. Okay, so this is the beginning of the Jewish exile. Now, although afterwards, later on, the Jewish people did return from Babylonia to Israel, but it was never a complete return. The Jewish community in Babylonia stayed on, and it ultimately became the center. So the Jewish people were exiled to Babylonia. Before they went there, actually, the first ones to be exiled was a group of Torah scholars. So when they went there already was a spiritual foundation for them. So they weren't just grappling in the dark, but the leaders were sent there beforehand, were taken by the Babylonians first. Then in Babylonia, which later was conquered by Persia and Media, the story of Purim happened when King Ahasuerus had an evil advisor Haman who wanted to annihilate the Jewish people. And we were saved. That's why we celebrate Purim. After 70 years of being exiled in Babylonia, they were given permission by King Cyrus II to return to the land of Israel, rebuild the temple. Many Jews went, and many Jews stayed. I think 40,000 Jews went. Most of the Jewish community stayed in Babylonia. And even as the second temple was rebuilt, more Jewish people went back to Israel, but there always was a consistent Jewish community in Babylonia. And then after the second temple's destruction, which was by the hands of the Romans, and how that happened is a fascinating tale in its own right. But basically, it was the Hasmonean kings who were the rulers of Israel after the story of Hanukkah. And there was a fight between two factions within the Hasmoneans, and so they invited the Romans in. They invited the Romans in to try to keep peace between them. And once you invite America, I mean you invite the Romans in, what ends up happening is that they slowly but surely take control. And that's what happened. The Romans took control, and then they were upset at the Jews in Israel not listening to them, and they destroyed the temple for a second time. And it was also, the Talmud says actually, that what was the spiritual reason why the second temple was destroyed? So it says the Talmud over here, and Alan, you can read this piece.
Second Temple era, during which the people were involved in Torah, mitzvos, and acts of kindness. Why was it destroyed? Because there was baseless hatred among them.
Right. So that was the primary sin of the Jewish people in that era, was that there was baseless hatred. And that's, as we mentioned earlier, the way to, when we think about why we're exiled, we think also the reason why we're exiled is also the same. When we counter that, then we'll be returned to Israel, and with the rebuilding of the third temple, the coming of Mashiach, and that will be when we have the opposite of baseless hatred for a fellow Jew, which is baseless love, loving someone even if they're not undeserving. And that's what we need to work. That's what be our focus now, and especially now, this time of year, we're in what's known as the 3 weeks, the 3-week period of mourning over the temples, which will culminate in Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the day that both temples were destroyed, which will be in 2.5 weeks. And it's a period of mourning, but we won't just mourn the past, we also hope for the future and take active steps to make that future into the present. Okay, and then from the exile of the Jews, from the destruction of the second temple, the Jews were still allowed to live in Israel, which was then the Roman protectorate of Palestine, but it was but many Jews were let out. So there still was a Jewish community there, and I believe there was consistently from then on a constant small Jewish community in the land of Israel. Sometimes it was larger, sometimes it was smaller, but there always were some Jews over there, or almost always. But most of the Jews at that point went all over. You could see a parallel to the history of the Jewish nation is also the history of the Torah study and the Torah works, where until the end of the second temple, teaching the teachings of the Torah were all transmitted orally from teacher to student. But after that destruction, once the Jewish people started spreading, there was more hardship in the world, and the community wasn't as close together geographically, so they had to actually transcribe those teachings to ensure the accuracy, because the accuracy the normal way they would remember their teachings, what they were taught when it was all orally, was to review everything 100 times. And to think of nowadays, to have the mind space that everything should be reviewed 100 times, is something which wouldn't be possible. But it also gave us the capacity, once we have those written works, it also led to the expansion of the understanding of the Torah also. So that you do see that parallel with the teaching of the Torah and the Jewish history. And so now this is where it leads us, that primarily after the destruction of the second temple is when Jewish dispersion really happened. As we'll see later, there are a few communities, specifically the Spanish Jewish community, as well as the Greek Jewish community, and I'm sure there are others, who claim that their community goes back to the second temple or even the first temple era when they were exiled there. That was the foundation of their community. But we'll speak about the different diasporas, and then we'll go into what the value is that we got from each of those places. So primarily, if you'll split the Jewish community as it is now into two, what would those two distinctions? What would they be? Would be Sephardim and Ashkenazim, right? What's Sephardim and Ashkenazim? Sfard is generally is a country of Spain, and Ashkenaz is Germany. Those were two, or before that, it was first Spain and France. And then from France, it went into the Jewish community from France spread northward to the Holy Roman Empire, to the German area. Okay, and so where do you see those distinctions? In many traditions, the different rulings, although both communities follow the same core set of Jewish laws, but there will always be differences in opinion, and those are generally each general region turn to its primary leader, and that's why we have different certain laws which are different by Sephardim versus Ashkenazim. Certain decrees, for example, on Pesach, Sephardim will eat rice and other kitnios, and Ashkenazim outlawed it. It was seen as something which was not. It was outlawed by a rabbinic decree, and that rabbinic decree was only accepted in Ashkenazi lands, but not in Sephardi lands. And to this day, those from a Sephardi background will still eat kitnios, rice and beans, etc. on Pesach. There are some differences, although the foundation of the prayer book is the same. There are some slight differences. There are different poems that go into one versus the other. And when the authoritative Code of Jewish Law by Rabbi Yosef Cairo was written, and he was from a Sephardi background. So there was a great contemporary of his, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, was an Ashkenazi, and he was in the midst of writing a similar code himself. And when he saw such a wonderful work, he figured instead of writing a separate one, he'll put his glosses on such a great work, and that's why this is a single work that's his glosses representing the Ashkenazi tradition. And that's why this is a single work that's universally accepted. The Sephardim will accept it as it was in the original, and the Ashkenazim will accept it with the glosses. There are many differences in customs, in ways of dress, in food, etc. And you see this distinction already in the verses in the prophecy of Obadiah. Obadiah himself, who prophesied about the Jewish existence during the exile, he himself was actually a convert coming from a Roman background. And in his prophecy, he says, and this exile of the children of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as Tzarfat, and the exile of Jerusalem that is in Sepharad, shall inherit the cities of the Negev. So where's the exile of Israel? Is in two places called Tzarfat and Sepharad, and the commentaries say Tzarfat refers to the land known as France, and Sepharad refers to the land called Spain. So you had two distinct major centers of Jewish life. When you speak of major centers, it goes together with cultural centers and also Torah centers, and they each have their own schools of teaching. And you had in Spain was a beautiful, thriving Jewish community, and they've met their contemporaries in France. Also, had a beautiful Jewish community, and we know and the differences became even more distinct after the Spanish expulsion, where the Spanish community was mostly went south, first to Portugal and then to the communities in North Africa, and to Turkey. It was where they found their refuge. The countries to the north, the European countries, weren't as welcoming to them, but Turkey was very welcoming to them. That's where many of them went to the Byzantine Empire. I believe then was it Byzantine then in that era? Whatever. But the Spanish community were to find its source. So you look in the Abarbanel, in his commentary, he writes, and I believe he himself was a Spanish scholar, and so he's writing about his local tradition, that Jews from the tribe of Yehuda went to Spain following the destruction of the first temple. For Pyrrhus, the king of Spain, brought them there. He settled them in two regions, the first in Lucena, which was then a great city in Andalusia, within the kingdom of Castile, and the second in the region of Toledo. So that is the distinction of those two. You have the Sephardi community, the Ashkenazi community, and so from France, for the Tosafists were in France, and there was some there's a lot of communication between the two schools. I mean, they had much respect for each other, but there were some differences in opinion, or especially differences in custom. And from France, they went to Germany, which is where the language of Yiddish was developed. Yiddish is Hebrew, a mix of is German written in Hebrew letters with many Hebrew words interspersed and many uniquely Jewish words as well, which developed as languages do. And then from there, they moved further east into Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Russia, the Russian Empire. Spain, on the other hand, had its own language, or which was Ladino or Arab, Arab Hebrew, right? And that was Arabic written in Hebrew characters, similar to Yiddish. And that also there's a thriving literature in Ladino. Spain had a very the golden era of Spain up until the Arab conquerors in the late 14th century. Was an era, a thriving era of Jewish life over there. And then from there, after their exile, they were exiled, they dispersed all over, still keeping to their communal customs. Then there were some other communities. So you have an area called Provence. You ever heard of it? Provence is a region between Spain and France on the coast. So there's cities over there like Lunel, Narbonne, and there are some great sages over there, even though it was a smaller Jewish community, but definitely in the history of Jewish scholarship, it punched above its weight. And here I'll tell you, there's an interesting tale that the Meiri, who was one of the great commentators on the Talmud, records about this clash of traditions that in the late 13th century, a group of prominent Torah scholars from Spain, who were disciples of the Ramban, Nachmanides, settled in Provence. And they encountered certain Jewish customs over there which surprised them. They felt that this is not the way we do things. We learned by the greatest of the greats in Spain, and they taught us differently. And they were saying how you guys got it wrong. For example, there's a prayer which we say in Rosh Hashanah, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Traditionally, most communities, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, do not recite it on Shabbos. But in Provence, they did recite it on Shabbos. Similarly, in Spain, then the custom was that after eating poultry, you don't eat poultry together with milk. But after eating poultry, as opposed to meat, you don't wait 6 hours. The 6-hour waiting period. In Provence, they did wait the 6-hour waiting period, which is nowadays it's become very commonplace, especially in many communities. But in those days, they saw it as something which is unique. For that matter, in Provence, they had 1 cup of wine under the chuppah for all the blessings instead of the 2 that were traditionally used. And so they went up in arms, fighting it out. And instead of, it first became just a bunch of insults with the Spaniards, the Sephardim coming with their coming and saying that we got it right, you got it wrong. Then they realized that they had in Provence, Provence has scholars in its own right, and they ultimately went to debate, and they debated all those customs, and they saw the Provencian rabbis were able to hold their own against the Spaniards and showed that they have strong basis in the Talmud for all their customs. Some things, in general, the Spaniards still kept to their traditions, but they recognized that there's validity to both approaches, and to ensure that the Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, who was a witness to this whole discussion, he wanted to ensure that the Provençal traditions don't get forgotten, and so he transcribed these debates in a unique book. All the traditions that the sages of Narbonne, Carcassonne, and Montpellier they got from them. He wrote down all those traditions with the reasons behind them. That way they will not be forgotten. Now, after the expulsion of the Jews from France, Provence was annexed by the French crown, and the Provençal Jewish community with its customs was absorbed into the larger Jewish communities, Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities, and today there is no continuation to that community in practice, but there definitely is in its intellectual history. It's a beautiful intellectual history. So that is another spot that we have, which was Provence, a smaller country. And then there's another one which has definitely a special place in my heart, which is Balkan Jewry. Balkan Jewry was a flourishing Jewish community. It was known as Romanioti, or the Bnei Romia, the children of Rome. Is generally, I mean, the Roman Empire, its heart was not just in the Italian peninsula, but also in the Greek peninsula and up into the Balkan Mountains. And they had distinct customs and prayer rites over there. I had the unique opportunity one summer as part of the Roving Rabbis program. I was sent to Greece, and we were lucky enough to have a week on the islands of Crete and Rhodes. But the other 2 weeks, we got to see the beautiful Greek interior, and we toured all the cities with small Jewish communities to visit these tiny Jewish communities with such a rich history. And we saw these communities, which are, these shoals, which are around for ages. These communities that had a history which was very unique, and we'll see over here actually from the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo records something unique that the Romanioti Jews would do. So, Jill, if you'd like to read this one.
The Romanote Jews follow the custom that the person called up to the Torah is the one who reads aloud, in accordance with the original Talmudic law. However, to avoid embarrassing those who are not expert in the precision of the reading, the grammar, and cantillation, they station a promoter next to the person called up. Prompter. This prompter recites each and every word first, and the reader then recites it after the prompter.
Thank you. So, sorry. So, here, let me actually show you. Let me share this over here. Yeah, so that was something they did uniquely over there, which was that they had generally in the Talmud says when one is called to the Torah, the one who's called to the Torah is the one who actually reads from the Torah. That was in our communities, that doesn't happen anymore because most people can't read from the Torah without practicing or without it being specifically the Bar Mitzvah Parsha, and therefore we just have someone, you make the blessing, and if you could, you read along as the person, the Baal Korah reads from the Torah, but over there they actually kept to that tradition. And they had many other traditions. For example, and here I'll show you some pictures. Can you see my photos over here?
Yes.
You see the photos over here?
Yeah.
So here, this is in the town of Ioannina. Ioannina is a small town, a beautiful town, nestled in the middle of mountains, right in the center of northern Greece. And over there, here's the entrance to, this is the entrance to the shul, I think to the shul courtyard. Yes, here you see the entrance to the shul courtyard. This is an inscription on the shul, which was built in Tafresh Mem Aleph, I think. So this inscription was made in the early 19th century, but the community there goes way back, long before that. And here you can see the shul. Well, you'll see some unique things in the shul, for starters. Here, let me see how I can point this out. So this is the entrance over here. You see the doors. I'll zoom in on the doors over here. Right, that's the doors. Let's see if we can find the front of the shul. 1 second. This is the front of the shul. With the Aron Kodesh, with the Torahs, right? The front of the shul, and this is the back of the shul. What do you see over here? A large stage with a bima on top. The Torah reading actually happened in the back of the shul. That was unique to Romanioti communities. And I saw a few shuls like this there in Greece, where the Torah reading happened in the back of the shul on a stage. There's other things also they did differently. For example, they would take out the Torah, and I saw this happening in the synagogue in Athens, where instead of just normally you want to show everyone the Torah, so you lift it up for all to see. The Sephardim will do it before the Torah reading, the Hagbai lifting the Torah. The Ashkenazim will do it after the Torah reading. In the Romanioti communities, they wouldn't just lift the Torah. They would actually have a special stage that was probably 20 feet long, a ledge, I should say, a ledge about 20 feet long. And they would roll out that much of the Torah, about 20 feet worth of a Torah scroll, so all can see and then they would roll it back to the part that they're reading, and then they would read from that. Also, for that matter, the way they would wrap the Torah, they would have a cloth that was wrapped into the Torah scroll. The Torah scroll was wrapped into that cloth. And then there's something else special I wanted to show you, so this synagogue, this community now has probably about, I was there 11 years ago, 11 summers ago. Then it had about 30, 40 Jews living there. You can see the size of the shul. It was made for 1,000 people, many hundreds of people. This is their ancient Torah, their Torah on display. See if we can zoom in here. Can we make out some words over here? Right? Okay. But I also had the opportunity to meet, this is the president of the shul who showed us around. This is just someone who lived, another Jew who lived in the area. And this is the chazan, the cantor of that community. Let me reshare because I don't, did I share sound? Can you hear this? Can you hear?
No.
No, I
Okay,
can't hear it.
You can't hear. Okay, so let me share this again. Share sound, optimize for video sharing. There we go. Share. So this is the very last chazan of that community. He was then in his mid-90s. He played for us recordings of himself singing the traditional tunes of that community that he had made when he was still in good health. So some 20, 30 years earlier, because he knew that with him, when he passes, these tunes will pass with him too. And here we had a session he was singing together with his record itself, these ancient Romanioti tunes.
Hear it now.
He's singing the Kaddish over here. I'll do another little one over here. This is from Kabbalah Shabbat. He's telling us as we welcome Shabbat in. Okay, there's some more from where this came. Let's go back to the other screen. Here we go. Okay. Yeah. So it was fascinating for me, and I saw this community really on its last legs. Where they don't get a minyan on a regular basis. Once a year, many of those who are from that community will come back for a Shabbos, but other than that, the synagogue mostly sits empty. It's just there for tourists. So that is the Romaniota communities, which was in mainland Greece. Athens did not have much of a community until just before the war. And also throughout the Balkans region, even up until Romania, was that community, and they had some of their own traditions. Not really known especially for, they're not many great Torah scholars from there, though there's a number. The Rabbi Matos-Mas'ei Fano is from that area, and some others. So it's not an especially well-known Jewish community, but it existed went way back. They also claim their roots to the First Temple era, similar to the Spanish community. Sorry. And what happened over there was when after the Spanish Inquisition, the Spanish expulsion of Jews. Sorry. After the Spanish Inquisition, the Jews from Spain were welcomed with open arms by Istanbul, then Constantinople, and they settled throughout the Turkish lands, including in Greece, very famously in the city of what they called Salonika, now known as Thessaloniki, which had over 100 shoals, and the port was 50% Jewish. So it was a major port city, and the ports would close on Shabbos because the Jewish people were primarily in the shipping business. But they also settled throughout Greece, and you had some communities which coming from the Sephardic communities, they thought they would be the prominent communities, but no, the Romaniotic communities kept their very own identity strongly. So some towns, you could have two towns side by side. One town would be Romanioti, and the other town would be Sephardic. More or less, they got along. Sometimes you'd have two different shoals in the same town, and then maybe it'll lead to some quibbles, but more or less, it got along. What ended up happening to that whole branch of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism, the Romaniotic communities, is that that region was the one that was hit the hardest by the Holocaust. 95% of Greek Jewry was killed by Hitler, by the Nazis. And so that's why there's very little remnants of them, but they have a very strong history. And I was lucky to be able to see that up close. Now, something which is fascinating that you see throughout Jewish history, throughout the Jewish exile, you see a few things I should say which are quite interesting. One is that there was always a haven open for Jewish life. Whenever one country shut its doors, another one opened it. Almost exclusively throughout Jewish history. So that, for example, after the Spanish Inquisition, the Ottomans, I should say, the Ottoman Empire opened its doors, right? I'm not sure. I think then it was already the Ottomans, but they opened after the Spanish Inquisition. The Ottomans opened the doors throughout history. Whenever we were kicked out of one place, we moved on to the next. Whenever one place became harder for Jews to live, there was another place that was possible for us to live. Another thing which you see fascinatingly throughout history is that wherever the bulk of the Jewish community was, that strongly coincided with the superpower of the era. So when the Jewish people were in Egypt, Egypt was the strongest empire in the world. After the Jews left Egypt, Egypt never regained its glory from back then. When the Jewish people were in Babylonia, the Babylonians were the strongest empire in the world. And then Persia and Media. But then the Jewish people left and their influence waned. And when the Jewish people exiled, Spain became the home of the largest percentage of Jewish people. And similarly, Spain also was the strongest power in the world then. And so on it went when the Jewish people were in Russia. Russia's rise coincides with the rise of the Jewish population there. And then once Jewish people were expelled from Russia, or no, I shouldn't say expelled from Russia, but Jewish life was cut out, and many Jews left. Where did they go? Well, many went to Israel, but the largest portion went to America. And together with that, America became not just a major power, but a superpower, more or less coinciding with the rise of Jewish life in America. And part of that, the Medrash, I believe, says, is because God, though the Jewish people are exiled, God does not want to do it for us in an embarrassing way. And therefore, he makes sure that yes, we can be exiled. We can be hosted by another country, but which country should it be? It'll be the superpower of the era. That way, at least we have the pride to say that it's not just any other yokel that we're exiled to, but rather a very strong country that's exiled to us. That we're exiled to, I should say. Now, there's the Jewish community in America, in the Americas, is a very interesting discussion in its own right. The year that Columbus discovered America coincides with the year that the Jewish people were exiled, that the Jewish people were expelled from Spain, 1492. There are those who will say that Columbus was Jewish. I have no opinion on the matter. Do any of you have an opinion on the matter?
I'm just going to say no. For no reason in particular.
Well, he set sail the day before the Inquisition started, and he had several crew members who were Jewish on his boat, on his ship. I don't know.
So there likely were Jews on his ship. What we do know for a fact is that his maps, his charts in those days, they navigated by the stars. And those charts were written up by Rabbi Avraham Zakuto, by a student, I should say, of Rabbi Avraham Zakuto, who was a great Jewish sage in Spain. So that much we know. It's very likely that a student of Rabbi Avraham Zakuto was himself on the boat as Columbus set sail. But there wasn't a Jewish community that went to Spain then. Even if there were a few Jews on the boat, I mean, they didn't settle in the New World. But the first Jewish community is one that started in the mid 1600s, the mid 17th century. Then around 1630, the Dutch captured parts of northeastern Brazil from the Portuguese. Now, Portugal followed Spain just a few years after the Spanish Inquisition was the Portuguese Inquisition. And Portugal followed Spain in expelling all the Jews, and they were with a vengeance. Jews were not allowed to practice Judaism in their land. It was either convert or die, or be expelled. They didn't even necessarily give an option to leave. It was convert or die. But this area in Brazil was conquered by the Dutch, and the Dutch knew that the Jewish community is had helped them build their empire in Europe, and so they encouraged a Jewish community to start up in the city of Recife, which is in northeastern Brazil. According to some reports, there were up to 1,000 Jews living in the city at a time, including a great Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav, who de Fonseca, who was actually a very well-known rabbi. Even to this day, he's a well-known name. And he was there for a few years as well as our chief rabbi. The city was much more Jewish than it was Christian. Jews were permitted to observe Shabbos openly, and on Shabbos, the commerce in the city would basically close down. What happened in 1654, the Portuguese reconquered Recife, forcing the Jews to flee. So most returned to Amsterdam, but there was one group of Jews a small group, about 23 men, women, and children, set sail for Amsterdam. What happened? Their ship was attacked by a Spanish privateer. All they had was stolen. They were left stranded in the Caribbean, so they took a small boat, and they ended up in New Amsterdam, later to be called New York, just days before Rosh Hashanah. But the governor over there Peter Stuyvesant, was a rabid anti-Semite, and he did not give them an easy time until his superiors, which was the Dutch West India Company, they overruled him because they had many investors who were Jewish, and they forced him to let the Jewish people settle. They settled in Manhattan and started a Jewish community called She'eris Yisrael, meaning the remnants of Israel, because they're just the remnants of a large group, and that was the foundation of the Jewish community in America. Okay, so that's that's a broad overview with a lot more what to see, but I'll need to apologize. I do need to cut it short. So just finish off with a quick thought. Why are we exiled to so many places? Not as a punishment per se, although maybe there's something of that. We could think about it and think about what can we do to merit returning to the land of Israel with the coming of Mashiach. We'll be able to live fully as Jews in the land of Israel, not just as individuals, but the whole all will recognize the value of the Jewish way. But the primary reason why we're exiled. Here, let me bring up the quote from the Talmud. Rabbi Yeshaya said, "What is the meaning of that which is written, the righteous acts of his rulers in Israel? The Holy One, blessed be he, performed an act of kindness toward Israel by scattering them among the nations." Okay, so this is something which is fascinating. I mentioned earlier that when Jewish people are scattered, why are we scattered? Because that way, no enemy will be able to destroy us all, right? If Hitler had his way, there wouldn't be any Jews here, any Jews nowadays. Thank God that he only had access to 1/3 of the Jewish nation. He didn't decimate us, he tertiated us. Decimate means 1 in 10, tertiated is 1 in 3. But thank God we're still here. Why? Because we're spread out. And that's a Jewish story. And not just we're able to live, but also we're able to thrive. So in one country, they outlawed Jewish life. Well, another country was able to live that life.
I turned my mute
I
off.
think I got disconnected over
Oh,
there.
there he is. Yeah,
Yeah.
there you are.
Sorry, do you hear me now?
Gone again.
Yes, now I can see you
Okay.
again and hear you.
Okay, so the Jewish people I was saying that the Jewish people were not just a no nation can destroy us at once, but more than that is that no one had that we're always able to practice, and therefore we can always strengthen the Jewish people around the world in place where they can't live as Jews. So, for example, the Jewish people under communism were able to live strongly as Jews. Why? Because they were inspired. Drew strength that there are Jewish communities active in other countries where they could live as Jews. And then there's one more point, which is that. Here, I'll read just from the top over here. Our sages of blessed memory said, the Holy One, blessed be he, did not exile Israel among the nations except to the converts would be added to them. And as you'll see over here, it doesn't mean literally that we should be having more converts, although there have been many people converted to the Jewish nation. It's not nearly enough to justify all that we've been suffering. Rather, it means every single thing which we take and we elevate to make holy, that is sort of converting. We're taking the spark of holiness and bringing it into Jewish life. For example, all the delicious foods that we brought, all the methods of song, all the types of thinking, the poetry, etc., that we've taken from all over the world and brought it into the Jewish fold, and all the parts of the world that we've elevated, that nowadays there's barely a country in the world that does not have a Jewish presence, all comes because God has sent us all around. So the only reason why we have the global influence that we do is because we've been exiled. So is it something positive? We pray every day that we can go back to the land of Israel, but we also celebrate the impact that we can have in our host country, and we celebrate the country that we're in. And America wouldn't be the same without its Jewish people, and the Jewish people would not be the same nowadays without all that we've learned from the American perspective. And there's a lot of good to be taken from there. We try to only take the good, and with that, we can say that this has been that the exile of the Jewish people has been a successful experiment, and we pray to God that the experiment has lasted long enough, and maybe it's time for the experiment to come to an end and for us to celebrate all together, returning to the land of Israel, maybe speedily in our days. Thank you all for joining. Sorry, I got to run.
Thank you very much for taking your time.
Take care.
Thank you.